did you want to say anything before we kick off here, as you're the main driving force behind the organization of these webinars?
Hi, good morning, everybody. This is Susan Catlett with New Jersey DOJ. We were trying to get some information relayed in a manner that would reach the most number of people in the fastest amount of time. And so we were doing these webinars, and as I think it was April maybe that announced earlier, they are being recorded so that we will be able to pass it along to other partners that we have that have not been able to get on the call in the webinar today. We are hoping that everybody walks away with a lot of benefit from this, so that when we have our ICM workshops next week, that it will be a benefit and we can all, maximize the time that we spend together next week. So hopefully everybody walks away with productive information out of this, and thank you.
Thanks, Susan. So we'll just push forward then in the sake of time. This is the second webinar. Hopefully most of you were online for the first webinar yesterday, which is sort of a primer or an introduction to the basic concepts of ICM, because this is really picking up and following forward on that by looking more specifically at some of the analysis, modeling, and simulation components, or what we commonly abbreviate as AMS. This is giving you a primer on how AMS methods can be used and should be used in an ICM analysis, and specifically how they may differ than some other typical AMS methods that we use for different analysis methods in our work. So just a brief agenda, a very abridged version of the overview of ICM, since we did see most of this yesterday. Discussing what the role of AMS is within an ICM analysis, and then looking at some recommended AMS approach work steps, and finally we'll look at some lesson learned from some of the ICM pioneer sites. So the goal for today's webinar is really just to provide a primer on applying AMS for ICM concepts. As a goal that's not too complicated, in practice there's lots of little finite details that can get very important when you start to look at an AMS. So you're certainly not going to come away from this being an expert on how to apply AMS for an ICM, but it hopefully will start to help you key in on some of the key questions that you should maybe be thinking about, especially as you move forward with the applications of the ICM contracts that were recently kicked off for both New Jersey Northeast Quarter and the 495. And please, this webinar is for you, so if you have any questions along the way, please bring them up and interrupt me. This is not, nobody wants to hear me lecture for an hour, so please ask your questions. You can either type them into the chat window, or don't hesitate to just take yourself off mute and ask the question along the way as well. So just to get a better idea, we can see the chat list who's online, so we have a good idea as to who's online and the agencies that they're from. But more specifically, I was hoping to get some sense of your expectations for this webinar, and especially to help guide this a little bit more towards what your experiences are, some of your experiences in using AMS methods. Not necessarily for ICM, but for other transportation analysis. So feel free to just type into the chat or chime in on the phone if anyone's feeling brave. Okay, we got a shy bunch today, that's fine. But as I said, don't hesitate to bring up questions along the way, and hopefully we can have you taking away as much as you can from that. So the overview of ICM, again, a lot of this was looked at yesterday, so I will be very brief on this. But integrated corridor management is really starting to look at the networks, the transportation systems that we have that are not just a freeway, not just an individual corridor, but looking at a wider corridor and trying to use management strategies to optimize the use of that existing infrastructure to try to prevent the need for adding additional facilities. Because we're often, especially in this part of the world, in the Northeast, we are becoming more prohibitively able to actually expand our roadways, so we have to focus more on managing it more efficiently. I wanted to bring up a list of different potential ICM strategies that we may consider, especially because this factors into some of the AMS capabilities that we need to look at within the models that we're going to be using to analyze and evaluate these strategies. So there's a long list here. This is not an exhaustive list. There are other things on here that could still be considered ICM strategies. But this is a quick overview of the different types of strategies that you might want to try to implement within an ICM framework. This should look familiar if you're on the webinar yesterday. The 7-phase ICM implementation process. Again, this follows the standard V diagram for systems engineering. And I do want to point out in here how the AMS components integrate with the different portions of the ICM implementation process. In reality, AMS should be present along the way throughout most of the steps in the ICM implementation plan. This is the most effective way to get the best results out of an ICM implementation. It starts off sort of at the stage where you are now, where you're starting off some of the initial plannings and developing the con ops for the ICM. You need to at least not necessarily be developing an AMS tool at this point, but you need to start to be thinking about how an AMS tool will help you in the future development of an ICM program, because hopefully everybody wants this to move forward beyond a con ops and actually move in towards implementation, towards actually getting it out there in the field to improve the roadways that we have. So just keep that in mind as we're moving into the con ops phase at this point, that AMS is not purely a future step in this process, that it does factor in within the con ops as well. So the role of AMS in the ICM, it comes back to why we're planning for operations in the first place. Again, I believe this slide was presented yesterday, but I think it bears repeating here. How the different sources of congestion across the networks and the causations for those systems out there. So in this particular case, these are all national average stats. Bottlenecks, or what we often refer to as recurring congestion, is typically less than half of the actual delays that we see out there over the course of a typical year. That's what we often are traditionally used to planning around. Driving towards more of a planning for operations mindset, we really start to look at some of the other 60% of the delay that we're seeing out there in our transportation network. Not only how we deal with traffic incidents and accidents and the delays that they occur, but how we deal with work zones, inclement weather, poor signal timings. As a nation, we're still doing fairly poorly in managing the signal timings that we have out there. It's somewhat understandable because it's such a huge task. And then also dealing with special events or other conditions, in particular in the Northeast Corridor. I always pay attention to whether or not there's a Giants or a Jets game in the Meadowlands, because I know that's going to influence my commute. How those special events factor into things as well. So the role of analysis tools within this environment, we are really trying to look at how to analyze different alternatives to try to move towards an optimized transportation system. The AMS tools, it takes a lot of complex concepts and data and really boils it down to some fairly intuitive costs and benefits that are understandable by stakeholders and decision makers, and hopefully that this will help improve the decision making along the way. Some of the key things to think about from an AMS perspective here is, what strategy is most effective, and then how do you determine that? How do you know which potential scenario, management scenario that you're looking at there? How do you know how it's going to improve or change the systems that you're trying to manage? And then how do you measure that as well? That's a key thing once you move forward to actually trying to prove that the systems that you're talking about implementing are going to be useful in moving forward and improving the future system. Because it comes down to the key idea that you're not going to invest in these systems unless you have some sort of reasonable expectation that they're going to improve things. And given the cost of some of the systems, just a reasonable feeling that it's going to improve, that can often be a very risky thing to move forward with. So this gives you some more information to help you improve on the decision making as to what move forward, and frankly, even at times, trying to push that forward and get funding for those improvements as well. So within the FHWA ICM initiative, we have, through the Pioneer sites, of all of the Pioneer sites, 3 of them moved forward onto the AMS stage for consideration a few years ago, those being Minneapolis, San Diego, and Dallas. And this is a very quick and short summary of a lot of analysis and effort that went into these 3 sites to just try to peg what the potential benefits would be and how the cost of those systems would line up versus those benefits. And in these particular cases, each one of these sites was generating really pretty good cost-benefit ratios as to how the ICM strategies could potentially improve things. So in these particular cases, we're looking at not only at all of the benefits in the system. We're looking at user benefits. We're looking at improved operational efficiencies through fuel savings, reduced emissions, improvements in travel time variability, various different components of how the system can produce benefits. So pulling back a little bit from ICM and looking a little bit more at the simulation and analysis world.
Can you go back to the slide? This is Vasa from New Jersey DOT.
Sure.
Previous slide. If I read this correctly, like for example, Dallas, is that $14 million over 10 years? The AMS cost?
Yes.
Okay. So this is projected. Okay.
Yes, of course. Yeah. This is all cost benefits analysis that came out of the analysis stage. So this is all pre-deployment evaluations of costs. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
We actually are going through some of those stages right now to try to look at some of the post-deployment applications and to try to better refine and maybe look at some of the actual incurred benefits that we're actually seeing out there in the world. But
okay, so all right. So this is like purely based on I guess modeling at that time, and the benefits and obviously the cost, or this was based on simulation.
This is based on the simulation and analysis results, correct?
Gotcha. Okay.
So the way that, a little bit of background on this. So it actually was a simulation of various different conditions on the roadways, not only recurring, but various different incident scenarios as well. And then we simulate with and without the ICM strategies into place. We measure the benefits and compare those benefits between those two model runs, and the differences between those two are attributable to the ICM improvements. But we'll get into that a little bit more later as well. So within the AMS world, there's a whole variety of different tools that we can pull from. It's not just purely simulation. It's not just purely demand modeling. In some cases, we look at more just sketch planning elements, more deterministic tools, much more simplistic tools, but often tools that it's difficult to do simulation on. So within this figure, you can see the vertical axis is the order of magnitude from at the low end, a very low order of magnitude, a very high level look at things versus driving down towards the top, where we start to look at a very detailed system or element that we're trying to look at, getting down to individual roadways, individual intersections. So then the x-axis is, again, looking at, on the left, we have the preliminary screening, where we're just starting to do feasibility assessments as to what we might want to be able to try to implement, and then driving forward to the right side of the graph, where we're actually starting to look at very specific operation strategies or design options that we might want to try to implement into the system. So when we start to look at the ICM, we are starting to look more towards the upper right portion of this world, but it's not exclusive, because we also need to be looking at the travel demand patterns for the region, and especially we need to start to look at some of the operations data to try to not only use this to help build the simulation of the AMS tools, but also to use that within a deployment sense so that we have a better case for how things are actually changing out there in the system. If you don't track your performance, you have no idea of how you're performing. So a method that often needs to be developed when you start to look at an ICM AMS strategy is a multi-level analysis, or what we sometimes refer to as multi-resolution modeling. This particular graph incorporates all of the different travel demand modeling elements that we typically see in a macroscopic world, driving through to a mesoscopic simulation or modeling environment, and then sometimes drilling down to the microscopic individual facility levels. And the different methods and the different levels that you need to look at, it really needs to be determined on a case-by-case basis. Because each one of these tools has different advantages and, frankly, different limitations as to how they can be applied in assessing your operations. Going through some of the initial AMS sites, we did discover, not surprisingly, but there are limitations within these methods as well. Some of those key modeling gaps, a lot of those focused not necessarily around how vehicles and how the system will operate under various different demand loads, that we have a fairly good understanding of. A lot of the things that are difficult to incorporate into some of these models is really when you start to look at some of the human response elements as to how people are going to react to the different strategies out there. Some specific examples of this are how people react to information that they're given, either on a DMS sign out there on the roadways, or through a cell phone application, some sort of in-vehicle tool, all of these things. Not everybody is going to pay attention to and consider the information that you're giving them.
That's a typical case.
Not everybody's going to see all of these different factors.
Subdivide into all these sub-components.
Drill into how the different models predict what's going to happen.
Right.
So those are, another example.
Maybe
when it comes to pricing,
cut out the compartment. Because it's a very difficult case to compare clothing with.
Just if everyone could just check in, put themselves on mute. All right, thanks. So another example, often this is also sometimes an ICM strategy that you're trying to look at, is starting to look at congestion pricing, whether it's through a managed lane or a hot lane scenario, or whether we're actually starting to look at cordon congesting options, things like that, peak hour versus off-peak pricing differences, all of these sorts of congestion pricing. That's another area that it's often sometimes difficult to incorporate into these models. The models are improving and moving in that direction, but it is a little bit difficult. Another key issue is to start to look at mode shifts. Mode shift is usually handled within a macroscopic travel demand model environment. It often is not captured within a mesoscopic or a microscopic framework, but often, especially because a lot of the times we're going to optimize the system not only for roadway, but trying to encourage good mode shares to try to get everybody out and use transit when they can. Trying to model that mode shift decision is often something that can be difficult to do as well. We also need to be able to interface these different models. There's been some good work done in this region, especially in New York, to try to integrate the New York BPM model within the city's Manhattan traffic model, and then even drilling that down into microscopic analysis to look at individual facilities analysis. That's the framework that you often need to have when you start to approach an AMS system.
I got a question.
Yes.
So the framework that's required, as you indicated, travel demand models, and then what about sensors to get the information that you were indicating that each of these models at different level has different level of granularity. So upon how deeper you want to go, what level of tools do you have to have in order to do that? The feedback loop.
It often will depend based on what the strategies are that you're trying to simulate. If you're trying to look at a very detailed signal optimization routine where you're trying to manage signal timings on the fly based on response, that's going to pretty much demand that you drill into a microscopic regime. If you're looking at more travel behavior responses, the mesoscopic platform is usually where you're going to land, just simply because it's large enough to look at a very large region, but detailed enough to look at some of the operation characteristics as well.
Yeah, but what hardware would you need in order to get that feedback? In other words, you yourself indicated about the effectiveness of a message that is posted on a DMS. So what would you need in order to get that feedback that, okay, this is how effective it was, in order to calibrate your model post-implementation?
We'll get into the data requirements a little bit down the road, but often it does require, pretty significant investments. So we'll look at the data a little bit down the road.
All right, thank you.
Okay. So the next question is, we have to have a methodology as to how we're going to be reducing the AMS analysis that we're looking at. Whatever the framework is, that the modeling framework that gets deployed here, it has to be able to calculate or estimate, evaluate the benefits and the implications of an ICM system. So we need to be able to look at some of the performance metrics that we're going to be measuring, delays, travel times, speeds, queues, emissions, those sorts of elements. And it also needs to be able to actually simulate model the different strategies that we want to look at, and have to be able to deal with them all in one framework. If we're deploying multiple strategies at the same time, we need to be able to simulate each of those in concert, because often the benefits that you see from two systems deployed together, sometimes they cancel each other out, sometimes they enhance each other. Another important differential between an ICM strategy and a more traditional planning, modeling, or simulation analysis comes into when we start to look at non-recurring congestion conditions. If we're looking at recurring congestion, in general, the public will have a good pattern as to how they use the system, and they won't necessarily deviate from that pattern unless something forces them to. And that is usually going to be some sort of non-recurring event, whether it's a very rainy day, whether it's roadway flooding, accidents of varying degrees. All those sorts of things are going to need to be able to be modeled to properly assess an AMS strategy. And again, these are usually time-sensitive, dynamic models that are developed. So it really helps evaluate how the system is going to function at the quarter level to help the agencies predict how the system is going to react to an ICM deployment. Just a little quote there from Bob Sheehan. AMS engages ICM partners in conversation around what it really means to operate the transportation system differently. I think this is really one of the findings that we have coming out of the Pioneer site deployments, is that people would get around the table and they would talk about ICM strategies, but until you actually see some of the results falling out, it really starts to drive home some of those connections. Say, okay, well, we need to be able to measure this in order to predict whether or not the system's working. We need to have these sorts of hardware in place to make these sorts of changes to the controllers or the connections to the traffic management centers. All these different elements, the AMS really tries to pull those all together and simulate those in a virtual world. And it really kind of pulls everything together to see how everything will need to fit together. Doing AMS for ICM, it is not insignificant. There is significant data that's needed to drive through to this, which we'll cover a little bit more later. It's not easy to do. There's a certain level of staff skills that you need to be able to build these kind of models and integrate these kinds of models. And it's not an insignificant cost either. So those are three fairly negative things. The advantage is really, it really does pay benefits to look at how the system is going to react under different potential strategies to help you fine-tune those strategies of what you might want to deploy in the field and how those different benefits may be received. So again, looking at the projected cost benefits from the three Pioneer sites, each one of them was returning very significant cost-benefit ratios. I believe they range, between 15 and 25, which for an ITS investment is fairly significant. So we'll get into those a little bit more down the road. We also have to keep in mind what the performance metrics are. Within all of the three Pioneer AMS deployments, we're looking at travel at traditional mobility elements, looking at travel times and delays that would be seen in the system. We're also looking at reliability. Some of the benefits of an ICM system are not necessarily going to help reduce average travel times, but they will help reduce the variability in travel time. And research into variability and people's sense of how a predictable travel time is, that sometimes that's even more important to them than what the average travel time is. If I know it's going to take me 40 minutes to drive 20 miles, I can deal with that. If I know it's going to take me anywhere between 30 and 60, that's much more difficult for me to incorporate into my daily life. We also want to look at emissions and environmental considerations here. And again, driving all of this down and monetizing all of these benefits and looking at the actual monetary value of those benefits so that we can directly compare to cost and do cost-benefit analysis.
Excuse me a minute. This is Susan. I have a question. On the previous slide, you were talking about fuel consumption and emissions and the benefit cost. Was the cost of fuel actually included in some of those costs for Texas and San Diego?
Yes. We actually did try to look at some environmental consideration. So not only looking at, having cars spend less time idling, less time traveling at slow speeds, not only helps emissions, but more efficient from the fuel consumption. So we did look at that. I will have to admit that was probably one of the smaller benefits that we did see out there, but it was considered.
Well, tied in with the fuel consumption, is it the consumption of the fuel or the price of the fuel?
We made estimates of gallons of fuel consumed, and then we used the going price at the time.
Okay, so if somebody went and did and crunched those numbers again now, with the fuel price being low, your benefit cost would no longer be as high as it would be from before?
Potentially, yes. But, as I said, the majority of the benefits we're seeing through the mobility.
No, understood. I just want to make sure I understood how some things were tied together. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we did not try to forecast the price of fuel over our 10-year horizons, because that's maybe a bit of a fool's errand at times. But yeah, it's all different sensitivities that go into it. Sure. So to drive home, again, just some of the value of an AMS system. It really helps you invest in the right strategies. It really is a predictive forecasting tool that you can do what-if scenarios on. You can deploy a single scenario, multiple scenarios. You can try to figure out what combination of scenarios is going to get you the best return on your investment and the best improvement to the operations of the system. We can do field tests. We can implement something in the field. We never are going to be able to do a real-world implementation of with and without a strategy. Everything we deal with on a daily basis, there are some things that occur that are very similar, but they're so few and far between that it's almost impossible to actually do a quantifiable assessment of the benefits that we're seeing out there without looking at some sort of modeling tool. It also helps you invest with confidence. It helps estimate the benefits of what you may get out of an ICM system. It helps drive home the fact that you're going to be seeing benefits from your system, so it can help it can help decision makers feel more comfortable pushing forward as well. It may help reduce some of that institutional risk that may be associated with moving forward and investing in an ICM strategy. It also helps lower risk with an actual implementation. If you did not do an AMS and you just jumped right into field implementation, there's a huge risk associated with what hardware to install, where does it need to be installed, how is it going to improve the system. As traffic management operators, you may have an idea of how that's going to happen, but it still would make it for a very risky investment moving forward with an implementation. And then again, yeah, go ahead.
A good question. This slide that you're showing, it's certainly, hitting a home run with me. But the question that I have is, are there reliable models that we can give to the consultant at, let's say, the planning stage? So something like this, ICM, a strategy could be evaluated versus adding a lane, and then the benefits, so that right straight off the bat at the planning level, somebody can say, okay, well, you know what, this is your perceived benefits of an ICM strategy, like you said, planning for operation, versus actually adding physical capacity. Right. The two examples, let's say the three examples, are these tools now, modeling tools, that refine that they can be utilized with confidence and compare alternatives, project alternatives, or strategies, and within ICM itself, like you indicated, and ICM versus traditional capacity enhancement strategies.
From a more traditional planning sense, the travel demand models that we're looking at, most of them are not capable of estimating the level of ICM strategies that you're going to see. So it often is not able to produce that level of effort. Quite often you do have to drill down and look at more specific simulation tools to help you estimate some of those ICM benefits. That said, there are sketch planning tools out there. One in particular worth mentioning is Costbenefit that look at various different types of operation strategies that you may try to look out there. And it doesn't do any actual modeling, but it will, using the research that is out there, it tries to help you estimate some of the level of benefit. But in terms of a direct apples-to-apples comparison, difficult to do with most standard existing tools, yeah.
Great, thank you.
And then just to finish this up, once you actually move towards a deployment, you develop these tools, you shouldn't just develop them and then throw them away. These really should be living models that help you continue to improve the system, help you reassess as maybe traffic land use patterns don't change the same way we had forecasted. It allows you to go back, modify, reevaluate, and reassess of the different systems that are out there. The other thing is moving forward into a deployment. We may actually see results out in the field that don't quite match up with some of the models. That allows you the opportunity then to not say the models are wrong and don't trust them. That's an opportunity to improve the model to allow it to help you better predict what's going to happen in the future. So one of the products that's out there, and the rest of this presentation is sort of a review of some of the contents of this, is the ICM AMS guide that was developed a couple of years ago. This was really driven by the lessons learned and the experiences that were gained through the 3 AMS sites in Minneapolis, Dallas, and San Diego. The link that you can actually access it at the bottom, but it's not a very user-friendly URL. So you can also just Google the FHWA Traffic Analysis Toolbox, and this is volume 13 within that toolbox to get you some good information onto how to use AMS within an ICM environment. So within this AMS guide, first of all, what is it? It's a step-by-step approach of how to implement ICM AMS and brings out lessons learned from the pioneer sites and the test site in the Bay Area, California, to try to help you not make the same mistakes or to learn from those efforts. Anybody who really is going to be involved in an ICM application, it's useful information in there, either whether or not you're on the technical modeling and analysis side, or whether you're a program manager who is overseeing an effort. There's something in here for all of you. Again, just to try to, the idea behind this is to help stakeholders implement ICM systems that are out there. So the organization of the guide is a little bit of intro background, an overview of the approach, and then it starts to look at the 5 distinct AMS work steps, which we'll go through here. And it also presents all of the lessons learned from the pioneer sites. There are other documents out there that are very useful. Some of these were, I think most of these were mentioned yesterday as well. There's a ICM AMS methodology that was developed before the AMS guide. So that was more of a document going into the AMS analysis. There's the ICM Implementation guide that April discussed yesterday. Also, For each of the Pioneer sites, the experimental plans or the analysis plans exist and are available. There's the final reports from all of the AMS studies. And while it's not necessarily ICM specific, there's a lot of good information in the traffic analysis toolbox that are out there, specifically dealing with traffic microsimulation, work zone analysis, DTA modeling. All of these things are useful information moving forward. And again, there is an NHI course out there of how to properly use the different traffic analysis tools, whether it be a deterministic sketch planning all the way down through detailed microsimulation, how those different tools fit in and can be used. So the 5 main work steps within the AMS process. First and foremost, you develop your analysis plan. You have to have a sense of where you're going, how you're going to get there. It's almost, this goes back to a systems engineering approach as well. You have to lay out and think about what you're doing before you do it, otherwise you're going to make mistakes, and it's going to be more costly down the road. Critical to an AMS approach is the data collection. It's important to really think that through and make sure that you're getting all of the data that you need. Again, step 3, model setup and calibration. Earlier there was the comment of what it takes to set up the models to run these, and one of the key words that you used there, I believe it was a reliable model to predict what's going on. If you don't properly set up and calibrate a model, you can't necessarily trust the results that are coming out of it. So that's critical to make sure that you can analyze the different scenarios. Once you have that model, then you can jump into the alternatives analysis to do those various what-if scenarios and test the different ICM strategies. And then driving through again, after the main process is over, there's always should be the thought of a continuous improvement within your AMS tools to make sure that they stay relevant, to be used whenever they're needed to look at different outcomes. So within the first step, developing an analysis plan, again, is just laying the groundwork for the next steps. As to how you're actually going to produce the work. It can help, and especially if you consider the AMS elements while you're developing the ConOps, it can help you identify flaws or technical issues that you may come across down the road and help you correct for that before you get there. Part of this also will start to look at, to get to Tom's question, that was posted in there, how do you determine what's a large enough area for a large enough geographic area to build your AMS tool within? That is a difficult question to answer, and it's always very site specific. But especially considering that the goal is to especially start to look at some of the non-recurring events, you need to start to look at the environment that you're potentially going to be trying to use and shift people to deal with whatever incident you may have out there. So that may include parallel arterial routes, it may include parallel freeway routes, it may include transit alternatives. All of those things have to be considered in laying out the framework as to how you're going to develop your AMS tools. And that is a key consideration, is how large do you need to look at. In some sense, you could say to develop a good AMS tool for New Jersey, you would have to start down in DC and continue up to Boston. That's obviously not realistic, but there are limitations and trade-offs as to how large the model gets versus the level of detail you can look at. And there's often also drills down into some of the multi-resolution modeling approaches as well. You may have a large regional demand model that you're using to look at overall travel patterns, where you may be looking more at as a mesoscopic corridor tool, or again, the width of that corridor will vary depending on the infrastructure that you have to deal with. But as to how traffic will react to incidents and conditions within that corridor, and how they're going to rework and continue to complete their trip. whether it's diverting to an arterial parallel freeway or whatnot. So I know, in particular, example in New York, for the 495 corridor that we're looking at, realistically, you probably need to not only look at the parallel arterials, you need to look at the other major crossings between New York and New Jersey. So you have to look at the George Washington, you have to look at the Holland, not only the 495 Lincoln. But you may also need to say, okay, well, that's still not good enough. For a large regional perspective, maybe we need to consider diversions to the Tappan Zee. Maybe we need to consider diversions through the Verrazano, through Staten Island.
This is Andy. This is a really important discussion right here about setting up the analysis plan. And it strikes me that sort of embedded in a lot of these bullet points is how is this analysis going to incorporate transit? Because I think it's critical to be realistic about what transit can do in this corridor and what it can't. And I think you mentioned earlier about some discussion about understanding how people react to information that's provided to them. I may be biased here, but my general thought is that most commuters have determined their daily commute mode and they don't switch that very easily. So I don't think that a VMS sign telling people that there's a transit option that morning is going to necessarily be helpful. But I do think that whatever actions can be done to make better, that in combination with worsening congestion could make a significant change. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and I think how we incorporate transit in this analysis is critical.
It certainly is, and I mean, while the different ICM strategies that you may try to look at elsewhere, they may or may not be critical around the transit issue, every single one that we have looked at so far at least considers transit. Whether or not it's at the pivot point or not is, that's varying. But I mean, in the Dallas case, it was actually operated by DART, the transit operator there, trying to improve and use the ridership along the US 75 corridor to try to help that to offset the system. Same thing in San Diego, where you have the bus operations within the managed lanes. So all of those are critical points to consider as well. And again, looking at the analysis plan, you have to lay all this out on the table, and it forces you to look at these elements. I completely agree with your point.
Thanks.
In this particular region, there are issues because we tend to be already fairly saturated when it comes to transit use, at least within the New York area. It is a little bit of a different picture elsewhere in the country where, a full train, car, or bus is a rarity, whereas here it's a daily operation.
That's a good point. That's true.
But it is still something to consider. And, part of your ICM strategies may be, if you can, increasing the capacity of your transit systems, or just increasing the information that's available to people. A common ICM strategy is that was used in both San Diego and in Dallas was basically comparative travel times. If you're going downtown, this is your travel time on the freeway, this is your travel time on the light rail, or on the BRT. And it's not to say that everybody will switch, because everybody certainly will not. Especially if you're looking at the morning, then that may be one thing. If you're looking at an afternoon commute, I already drove in the morning, my car's already here, my decision is made. But it's the things that you have to think about as to how you're going to analyze this.
Right, I think that's a good point about comparative travel time, because even if somebody doesn't make a change that day, if that information is presented over time, it may cause people to at least try the other option.
Yeah. It's not necessarily making decisions for people. A lot of ICM strategies is just presenting as much information as you can to the traveling public. Some people will listen, some people won't. But even if we can capture, a 10% share, a 10% shift, that can often be all of that's needed to solve a lot of our problems. So in the sake of time, I'm going to flip through these slides a little more quickly, just so that we can especially get to the lessons learned at the end. But I believe we're going to be distributing the entire slide deck to you afterwards, so you can always take a look and reach out as needed. The individual steps that are within developing your analysis plan, of course, looking at the scope, describing the corridor and what's actually happening out there in the field. It's important to have a good assessment of the existing conditions and to make sure that you not only know what's going on in the system, but you know what's causing some of the problems that you're seeing in the system. Looking at the different analysis scenarios, there's a lot of good information that's going to be coming out of FHWA over the next year as to looking at these things. How do you not only look at your recurring or average conditions or a typical day, as we have traditionally done, but then how do we start to look at varying demand, looking at high demand days, looking at incident scenarios. All of those different conditions that each one is an individual scenario that makes up an entire year. So you rarely ever have a typical day out there on the road. It's usually a different variant of that typical day. So how do you actually look at each one of those scenarios, or an analysis or a condition scenario, and to see how ICM may be deployed there. Critically, you have to look at your data, what's out there, what you need, and how do you fill in some of those gaps. You also have to look at the performance measures, what you're actually going to try to measure, what metrics you're going to use to try to assess the benefits of your system. All of these things together will then help you select and determine what your AMS tools need to be. This gets into start to look at some of the multi-resolution issues, how you can utilize a demand model, where you're going to need an operations simulation, meso or micro model. All of those things can help you develop the plan. All of these things together will help lay the framework, lay out the plan for you to move forward with. And doing a good plan up front is critical to try to make sure that you don't make mistakes down the road. So some of the key outputs coming out of an AMS plan, it really just makes everybody think about what we're doing and actually look at it in detail rather than in concept. One of the key things, especially in some of the other Pioneer sites, were the various different MOAs or MOUs that need to be developed to allow the different agencies and stakeholders to work together, not just cooperatively, but in a effective and coordinated way. That sometimes, is difficult in a lot of different areas. So within the time frame, actually completed generally 4 to 6 months, it is a good idea to start to consider this as part of the ConOps development, or at least develop it in parallel. Start to look at some of these key elements, whether you may not be drilling down into the different analysis scenarios, but at least start to look at how an AMS tool is going to factor into the ConOps and the requirements that you're developing for your ICM system. It's not to be considered a locked-in plan. These often get manipulated and revised throughout the process. We never have perfect foresight. There is always learning opportunities, and the plan should develop and evolve as a living document throughout the ICM lifecycle. Some of the challenges, again, just not having a good idea as to what ICM strategies you're going to want to deploy. Maybe some unusual performance measures that we're not quite used to capturing, reliability being one of them. You really have to push beyond that average day mentality, which can be difficult. And again, it's challenging at times to make sure that you devise the tool that you're going to design and create to make sure that it's capable of handling what you need to. Because often, once you've gone far enough down that road, it's often much more expensive and complicated to refine that. Step 2, I think critical to a lot of people here is the data issues. I don't think there's a whole lot that needs to be said on the value of the work step. I think everybody understands the importance of data that will go into an AMS plan. If you don't have data to assess what's going on, you don't necessarily know how to improve the conditions. If you don't have the data to build and calibrate a model under varying different, analysis scenarios, not just under typical average volume conditions, but under high demand conditions, how the system operated and functioned under a high incident scenario. So let's say, we've had a couple of bad accidents on the turnpike lately. How did the system actually respond? How do people change their behaviors in response to those incidents? Having good measurements as to what's going on in the system is critical to helping you figure out what to do about it. So step 2, again, it really is the detailed steps that are going into this, actually looking at everything that's possibly out there, especially looking and identifying those data gaps that exist and trying to figure out how you're going to fill those data gaps that exist. Data management is also something to consider as well. We have to get out of the mindset of one-off ATRs, one-off turning movement counts. Those are snapshots as to how the system is performing. An analogy would be, okay, I can check my wrist and say, okay, well, there's a pulse. I know my heart's beating. It tells me nothing about how my heart is actually functioning. So there's the drive to look at continuous data collection throughout this process. That has to be moved more towards the forefront of how we think about systems, and it's a bit of a shift from the traditional sense that we look at planning workplace. So there are certainly data challenges out there, and these have not been solved anywhere yet, really. These are all continuing challenges. We're getting more and more towards solving some of these as we move more into the big data environment, but there are still lots of challenges out there that we have to face. One of the critical ones is actually just looking at the system coverage. Here in the Northeast, we have some roadway sensor locations. We don't have a lot. Other systems, particularly more in the South, where it's easier to do with pavement and the freeze-thaw conditions, you have permanent in-road sensors that really help them manage their freeways on a daily basis. Now, one of the key things there, as I said, freeways. Quite often, you really don't have a good sense as to what's going on your arterials. So that gap in the coverage is often one of the key things that you have to look at, because we are trying to manage a system. We're not trying to manage a freeway. The data quality plays into it as well. If you don't know the quality of the data, it's tough to trust it. The format and the resolution, because a lot of this we need to have it in a continuing system. Some of these data sets are very large and can be difficult to work with. We have to consider that as we move forward. Data integration, how the various different pieces fit together. What happens when we have conflicting data points? It certainly exists out there. It helps to have standards and consistencies that are out there. Backup, recovery, and archiving, especially when you start to look at an IMS framework, the archiving almost becomes critical. because we don't necessarily know any particular day that we may need to go back and look at. Quite often we need to pull the entire years of archived data to try to help us figure out what those typical conditions are, to look at major incident scenarios. You can't plan for that. You just have to be able to go back and look at archived data to figure out what's out there. And then, of course, the resources that can go into this. It's not a trivial thing. So traditionally, there's more and more of the big data coming online that allows us to look at a lot of these information. INRIX, TomTom, Navtech, the Clear Channel Toll Network, the HV data for trucks especially. A lot of these have good information as to how the system is performing. It generally is better on the freeways, but at least generally allows some information on the arterials. In this particular area, we are very lucky to already have Transcom in the picture because they're already taking care of a lot of these data fusion efforts. Frankly, I think Transcom has a very critical role in looking at how some of these various data sources that are out there, how they can be manipulated and used moving forward for an ICM strategy. There's also things to consider as well. In terms of the different, is quite often becoming much more easily to get is looking at the performance of the systems in terms of speed. It can be very difficult to get wide volume data. And, as we all know, speed flow diagrams are not linear. So if we know the speed, we don't know the volume. So quite often we'll take both the volume and the speed to really try to figure out how the system is performing. So again, looking at the typical outline of a data collection plan, really just making sure that you drive through and look at each of the elements that exist along the way. Especially looking not only at the freeways, which we're used to looking at, but looking at the arterials and looking at the transit data as well. Using a lot of AVL data or APC data that may exist on the transit system is going to be critical not only to help figure out what's going on in the transit system day to day, but especially when you start to look at trying to encourage people to go to transit. Not necessarily going to help you a whole lot if you tell people to use transit when the transit's already full. So looking at how transit data fits into this as well is important. So the time frame, 2 to 4 months, that's not data collection, that's to develop the plan. Again, we really want to try to drive home the idea that we need to start looking at archived data. If we have daily flows of information coming in as to how the system is operating, if we're not archiving that, we're losing a tremendous opportunity. There are definitely challenges associated with that, but it's critical to help us look back so that we can look forward. Some of the data challenges, again, just looking at the non-recurring elements. I'll give you an example of this. We're actually looking at a post-deployment assessment of the ICM strategies and pioneers in San Diego and Dallas right now. One of the things that we're looking at is we're now trying to go back and use the models that we have to try to model actual accidents and incidents that we saw out there. And we're trying to use the real-world data to help calibrate the models to make sure we're modeling the accident properly. In this particular case, it was a major accident. 3 out of 4 lanes were closed on a freeway. The accident duration was listed as 3 out of 4 lanes closed. The duration was close to 2 hours. And when we looked at the volume data at the sensors directly upstream of that accident, we had volumes that were close to 3,000 vehicles per hour. for the second hour of the incident. Obviously, if you only have one lane over, you're not going to be getting 3,000 vehicles through that single lane. So there's obviously a gap, something in here. Either the sensor data doesn't make sense, or in this particular case, we think more likely the accident record's just insufficient. Maybe there were originally 3 lanes closed. Maybe there was a progression as to how that incident cleared up. Maybe they originally got it down to 2 lanes closed, then maybe 3 lanes closed, and how that incident was actually cleared. That's often, sometimes, especially moving forward with the post-deployment stuff, that's some issues that we're trying to figure out, and a data gap that we didn't necessarily imagine along the way. We made sure that we had accident records. It's a question of the details that are in those accident records. So before I move on, I know data is critical, so I just wanted to open up to see if there's any questions. Okay. Model setup and calibration. Obviously, if you don't have a well-calibrated model, it's questionable to use it to look at alternative analysis down the road. So properly setting up and scoping your model as to just make sure you have the coverage that you need within the model is critical, and also making sure that the calibration effort is significant, is sufficient enough to make sure that you can trust the model. Some steps associated with this, looking at what calibration criteria you need to satisfy to make sure that you can trust the model moving forward. Looking at the baseline model conditions to try to make sure the model is replicating conditions. We have to look at the demand models. Rarely are the models that we're using for the meso models that we're using for operations, rarely are they large enough to look at the complete trip for everybody within the region, especially in this region. It's not going to be possible. So we have to be able to look at the underlying travel demand patterns that we're forecasting from travel demand models to make sure that we move that forward and incorporate that well into looking at our baseline model conditions. And then again, it's easy to say, but difficult to do, just the calibration of the simulation model itself. So on the screen here, we have some key factors to consider. Some of these points have already been brought up. The availability of data to feed the model calibration efforts, the size of the model that we need. Another key thing to consider is that the larger the model you build, even if it's feasible from a computational perspective, there's processing time issues that may need to go into this as well. So the larger you make the model, the longer it's going to take to run, and the harder it is going to be to calibrate as well. We have to look at different travel modes. Within the different frameworks, we may need to try to figure out how to incorporate transit and mode shift into the mesoscopic model. As I said earlier, that's one of the gaps in the modeling capabilities that we're often up against. We have to look at the different ICM strategies that we want to consider to make sure that we're developing a model of the right fidelity. We have to make sure we capture all those potential diversion routes, looking at multimodal transfer issues. We have to make sure we know the origin destination patterns of the trips. We're not modeling a vehicle on a freeway, we're modeling a trip. And for somebody to go from A to B, whether that's done by auto or whether it's done by transit, we have to be able to know those ODs in order to model that properly. Calibration of the baseline model, as I said, is critical. The key things to consider here as well, we have to make sure that we properly model the capacity of the systems that we're trying to model, so those corridor capacities. We have to make sure that we can realistically estimate route choice patterns. Not everybody's going to follow the same path to get from A to B. We have to make sure that the model is properly representing those various different choices. That can be difficult to measure in the field and to try to get a sense of whether or not we're actually modeling reality or not. There is a little bit more information as we're starting to move forward into some big data issues that we're actually starting to move towards actually getting route choice coming out of some of the big data sources, but it is still preliminary. We also have to make sure that we calculate the overall system performance measures. Again, we don't want to look at an ICM benefits as to say how it's going to improve conditions on the freeway, because if we make delays on the arterials worse, it's a net disbenefit for the system, and it's not something worth pursuing. So we have to be able to look at the overall system measures that we're looking at. So those are all more traditional calibration thoughts. Within an ICM framework, you also need to look and think about the various different incident conditions or analysis cases that you're going to be looking at. Looking at your high demand days, looking at your accidents, maybe looking at a game day or a special event generator. We have to start to look at all of those elements as well. We have to look at transit. HOV and parking ride issues as to how different people are using the transit and how that interacts with the auto share of a potential trip. Carpooling is another issue that has to be considered along the way. That you need to start to look at how people are operating under various different conditions. And then again, it's critical just to make sure that you get everything out there and publish everything as well. If you don't prove that the model is replicating reality, a lot of people are not going to be able to trust it. Again, the work step outputs, the key thing is just the calibrated model to move forward into your alternative analysis, and to make sure that you get that calibration validation report out there to make sure that it's not only replicating existing conditions, but even doing validation checks on it to say, okay, well, in a condition X, I simulate that, I look at the results of how the model responds to it, and we may not have, in an ICM environment, you are more likely to have data to actually help validate that against, but it has to be able to make sure that the reaction of the model is reasonable compared to our intuition. The time frame is very variable, depending on the complexity and size of the model. This often can be one of the more risky steps within developing an AMS framework, is to actually get the model up and running and calibrated. It requires a lot of time and investment. It often requires special skills, special technical skills in terms of model development and calibration, and integrating travel demand options as well. It's not trivial to do this, but it's important to make sure that it gets done properly. The stakeholders have to be involved in the review of the models to make sure that they know what is going into it so that they can better see what's coming out of it and be comfortable with it. And then again, just making sure that the calibration is good is critical to moving forward with using the model. Step 4 is actually fairly straightforward, but actually looking at the alternatives analysis, doing all of those what-if scenarios. And this is really where you go back to your analysis plan and say, this is what we said we were going to test. We push forward, we use the model to test it, to make sure that we're comfortable with the model and to try to get those various different sets of benefits that we have coming out of it. So by doing various different virtual what-if scenarios, it helps us look at the individual ICM strategies, look at the benefits coming out of it, compare that to the costs, look at different combinations of strategies to try to see how we can better develop ICM strategies or packages of ICM strategies to respond to various different conditions that we may see out there. So the steps that are actually go into it, we have to look at the future baseline conditions. We may be not looking at existing demands. We may be looking 5 or 10 years out, considering what what the time horizon is for implementing a strategy. You generally don't want to try to look 25 years out. Partially, there's a certain amount of risk associated with forecasting that far out, but you can also get into saturated conditions that, ICM strategies may not be able to handle. You get into into long-term recurring issues and aren't able to focus as well as to look at the impacts of the short-term, non-recurring conditions that you are really trying to focus in on within an ICM strategy. So I'll skip through these slides fairly quickly because we're running out of time. But again, drilling down into the performance measures, these are the key things that you're probably going to want to come out of. These are the ones that were used in the pioneer sites. But to look at how those different performance measures continue. One of the key things to note here is that to assess the benefits, you can't just look at the benefits of a high demand, high severity accident day and say, those are my benefits that I'm going to see. That condition may only happen 2 or 3 times a year. You may see tremendous benefits coming out of that scenario, but you have to prorate all of the different demands across the multiple different operational conditions that occur across a year to try to come up with an annual estimate of what your performance measures and your benefits are going to be. On the cost side, you have to look not only at your capital costs, you have to look at your operation and maintenance costs, you have to look at the annualized costs over the life cycle for the system that you're putting out there. There may be lower costs if you already have, as we do in this area, a TMC center that's already set up and fully operational. Adding additional capabilities into that TMC is a lot cheaper than developing them from scratch. So all of these different considerations have to go into the costs as well. So some samples from the AMS Pioneer sites, how the different numbers, the actual changes in performance, both with the ICM and without the ICM strategies, how those numbers lined up. Improvement in delay, in person hours, improvement in travel time reliability, gallons of fuel saved, tons of emissions, and then annualizing and monetizing those across a 10-year life cycle for the ITS hardware to come up with the final cost-benefit ratios. To look at, I think it was Susan that had the question earlier as to how the various different components factored into this. As you can see, fuel was a consideration, but the main driving element behind the majority of the benefits, this is in San Diego, the majority of the benefits were seen from just improved travel time mobility and improvements in travel time reliability. So the outputs, again, it really gives us quantifiable numbers that we can compare different strategies against. The time frame, it depends based on the number and the complexity of the schedules, but challenges, weighing the models against expected outcomes, really making sure that the outcomes of the models are reasonable and realistic. One of the things that you can often do to help mitigate some of those risks is not to just do an analysis saying, okay, I'm predicting a 10% response rate to a message that I put on my DMS. What if it's a 2% response? What if it's a 20% response? It sometimes is important to do various different sensitivity tests into some of the parameters that go into this to make sure that we're comfortable with the range of possibilities that are coming out of it. So then the final step is continuous improvement. It often is left out of an ICM process, but it's important to make sure that you keep in mind the idea of continuous improvement of the system to make sure this is a living system that moves forward and evolves rather than make sure that the models and the AMS strategies that you're developing can move forward. I'll breeze over this because challenges, and we often don't think about it. And it's at the end of the process, and we don't necessarily think about it. But again, it may require a bit of a mindset change as to how we think about the tools that we develop, and to make sure that they're capable of moving forward with us in the future. So some of the lessons learned from the Pioneer sites, we've covered a lot of this, I think, but it's worth going through and stepping through and making sure that we look at them all again. The role of the AMS, it is complex, it's not easy to do, it's invaluable to help drive a lot of this forward into actual implementation, and to help us to prevent making mistakes in implementing strategies that may not give us the benefits that we were expecting. A properly designed AMS helps identify deficiencies in the process itself. When you're actually trying to model a scenario, you have to get into each one of the details as to what goes into modeling that strategy. And it helps you think through all the different elements and what actually needs to go into it to help you define what comes out of it. Helps identify the actual benefits moving forward. Lessons learned from the AMS framework and methodology. Absolutely, the different tools have different capabilities and advantages and disadvantages of each. There is no silver bullet out there. There is no one modeling platform or component that generally will be used. More traditionally, with the work that's been done, we tend to rely a little bit more on some of the mesoscopic tools because they're large enough to be regional and look at an entire corridor, but they still have that operations tie-in that we can look at responses of individual vehicles and individual travelers as they're moving through the system, how they respond to different elements. But again, how people respond, there's gaps there as well. There's a reason we have such a thing as a stated preference survey and a revealed preference survey. These things are difficult to capture, and they vary day to day. The way I respond on a Tuesday may be different than when I respond on a Wednesday when I have an important meeting I have to get to the office for. Those sorts of ideas. It's very variable, and often you have to look at the sensitivity of the different variables. Because quite often we have to make assumptions as to how people will respond to these things. So it's important to test the sensitivity of the results that we're looking at against those input parameters. Some of the data elements, again, data is critical. But having a good archived data set that we can draw back on is really critical to a lot of these things moving forward. And the model development, again, this is often one of the most risky tasks and one of the most time-intensive and costly tasks. But it is important if you don't develop the model properly and you don't calibrate the model properly, there's all sorts of variability and risk that can come into the outputs of the model. The whole idea of the AMS system is to try to reduce that risk. So it's time intensive, it's cost intensive, but it does pay off in the end to try to help us prevent making mistakes moving forward. So that's the presentation of the primer. This was a reduced primer based on a workshop that we sometimes deliver for FHWA. So this material was covered kind of quickly today, but hopefully give you a good sense of what to think about moving forward, make you aware of some resources that you can draw upon moving forward. And if things continue along the way as well, and this is really something that the sites want to look more carefully at, this is originally developed to be more of an interactive 1 to 2 day workshop to cover the bulk of this material. So I know that's a lot of information quickly, but hopefully it was useful. So I guess just quickly open it up to questions if anyone has any.
A really quick question, because I know we are running out of time. So all the three test sites that were selected, were the models developed from scratch?
No. Within Minneapolis, a dynasty model was used for the bulk of the analysis. That model was actually originally developed to look at some of the impacts with the bridge collapse that happened there. So that model was repurposed, but certainly improved to look at some of the ICM strategies. In San Diego, that was a new model that was developed. In Dallas, I don't know for sure, but there was significant effort that went into developing that model as well.
So the cost of developing this model, that's inclusive of, let's say, the ICM itself, or that's an overhead that the agency would have to sort of incur?
It is certainly something that you need to plan for, yes. I think in those pioneer sites, FHWA was a little bit more willing to invest in the model development costs there. I think moving forward, they're certainly willing to subsidize that, but I don't think, maybe I shouldn't speak out of, I'm not with FHWA, but my sense is that they are looking for a little bit more of a cost-sharing approach in the future.
I got you. But is there a, oh, okay. No, I guess, well, thank you. No.
Okay.
Because we are running out of time, too, so I don't want to.
Well, I don't have to go anywhere. I don't know if I certainly want to try to answer any questions. So, I mean, you have my contact information there if you want to follow up with me offline. Of course, feel free.
All right.
Thank you. It was very helpful. Appreciate it.
All right. Glad to be of help.